Good day to you. You know, I've been teaching for a long time, almost 30 years as an assistant professor and then on up to a full professor. But I still remember one of the classes that I had when I was a graduate student at Penn State. This was a class called Intro to Communication. And one of the icebreakers that I do in that class is I invite the students to go around the room one by one and talk about something they hope will happen as a result of taking the course. Let me let these couple cars pass. And as we went around the room, almost every student said something like, I hope to be successful. I hope to live in California. I hope to raise a family. And then suddenly it came to a student sitting at the front of the room. She was from Vietnam. And she turned around and faced the entire class and said, I hope that we all have a wonderful experience in this class. And then she turned back around and faced the front of the room. It was a seminal moment for me because it reminded me that other cultures do see things from what the book calls a collectivist point of view. That means looking out for the group, in this case, as a whole, or society as a whole first, before you look out for yourself. And so that introduces our subject for today. As I'm walking down Analomink Street here in East Stroudsburg towards the campus, we're talking about dimensions of culture. And we can look at these dimensions of culture as rules for how people should behave. You know, like when you grow up in the United States, you learn that one of the rules is that if you go to a sporting event like a baseball game or a football game, basketball, hockey, whatever, you have to stand up and you have to take your hat off when the national anthem is played. If you don't, you're going to get some really nasty looks and you'll be seen as unpatriotic. Of course, you can defy the rules, but the rules are so strong that we often don't. Even if you're not a big nationalist person, you'll stand up and do that to comply. So as we head into this chapter, the first thing we're going to take on are a bunch of dimensions of culture that were developed by a Dutch management researcher. His name was Geert Hofstede. And he's got these Geert Hofstede dimensions, the first of which is individualism versus collectivism. And I'll let you read the details of the examples for the countries in the chapter, and I'm going to just try and outline some of the general principles. And as I do, more than anything, I really want you to focus on your own culture today. Think about how your own culture is illustrated by these dimensions. So individualism versus collectivism speaks to such elements as family, relationships, workplace relationships, and the way that people communicate. In essence, in an individual culture, you prize the individual's needs over the group's needs. And we can see that very much here in the United States in terms of family, for example. We see that the average family household, like this one behind me probably, though I don't know it for sure, I'm pretty sure that there's no grandmother, there's no grandfather living there. I'm pretty sure there's no uncles. I'm pretty sure that almost all of these houses on Analomink Street have single family homes, and in many cases just single people living. In collectivist cultures, the idea is that the family is what matters. And even though it would be less convenient for you to have your grandmother living in your home, the fact is that that's what is important, is to care for your family members. So if we broaden that to something like sidewalks, look at these sidewalks here as I'm walking up. This is Stemple Street. See all those cracks? Can you imagine pushing a stroller up a sidewalk and what that would be like? Why is it that we have cracks on the sidewalk? Why is it that an elderly person is going to have a hard time going up these sidewalks? That's because in the United States, we believe that the individual is responsible for their own sidewalk. So this house right here, whoever owns this house, if they don't come out, and this little bit of pavement right here that's my foot's dragging on, I don't know if you can see it, that little lip right there, that's probably not going to get taken care of because it's up to the individual. It's their property. It's their right. But is that good for the people who use the sidewalk? No, especially not if you're pushing a stroller, especially if you're a person with a disability or an elderly person. So it's just one tiny example of individualism in our particular culture. We can see individualism versus collectivism play out across the world. Generally speaking, more Asian, Eastern countries have more of a collectivist sense of behavior to them. Same with the Middle East, the Arab world. Western countries have more individualism to them. All right, the next element that we're going to talk about is masculinity versus femininity. Now, this is not what it seems. This dimension speaks to if a culture is masculine, it's saying that the roles that are performed by people in society are very distinct between what males can perform and what females can perform. Whereas in a feminine society, there is more equality. So we can say, for example, that in Mexico, I take a lot of public transportation down there. I take a lot of buses. They're really great. They're really cheap. They stop everywhere. You don't have to go to a bus stop. You just stick your arm out. They pull over. You get on. And you get a great view. And they're very reliable. And they come all the time. But I've never seen, in my 11 years in Mexico, I've never seen a female bus driver. That's because that position is a very male position. It's for men. It's for masculinity. It's for a macho kind of expression in the job place. So it's an example of how a culture such as Mexico can be a very masculine culture because it's not saying that women can have that job as well. In female or feminine cultures, you have the opposite. You have female presidents. You have female company directors. You also have males at home caring for kids, right? It works both ways. So that's what masculinity versus versus femininity refers to as a dimension. Next, we come to the power distance dimension. And what this speaks to is how culture deals with inequalities. Like there's going to be inequalities, right? Look at this row of houses right here. That person has less equity in their house, less wealth than probably maybe this person who has a little bit bigger piece of land and property seems a little bit better kept. I don't know. I'm making judgments here. Should there be more equality? Not in our society. We don't perceive that. And that's why some of the houses that I just walked past on Antelope Street, they may actually be welfare houses. There may actually be people living in those houses who are about to be kicked out because they can't make rent. I don't know. I'm making assumptions. If you go to a country like Sweden, Sweden has very, very low power distance. And what that means is that inequalities are narrowed. So whereas in Sweden, you will not find abandoned houses, you will not find boarded up houses, you will not find a single homeless person in Sweden because nobody has to be homeless if they don't want to. The government will provide housing for you. But at the same time, you find no mansions. You don't see big 4,000 square foot houses. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but I've never seen one. I've been to Sweden many times. So Sweden has low power distance. Countries with high power distance have great inequities going on. And the children in high power countries are expected to be obedient, expected to follow rules to help accentuate those power distances. All right, next up is the dimension of uncertainty avoidance. And this is the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertainty. You know, what's going to come next. In cultures that have high uncertainty avoidance, teachers are experts. You're expected to be able to, as a teacher, you have to have all of the answers. And that's because the students in a high uncertainty avoidance culture are very uneasy about not knowing answers. We can say that in high uncertainty countries, you have the rise of religion because people are just not comfortable with the idea that when somebody dies, that may be the end. There's no more. All right, so that's high uncertainty. That's uncertainty avoidance. Now I'm pausing here in front of my mom's house here. I just want to stop in for a moment and illustrate a kind of collectivist behavior. I'm going to check on her and see how she's doing. She's got her door open, so I know she's awake this morning. That's her dog, Hallie. And as she's coming to the door, I want to introduce the next dimension that we'll be covering. Oh, here she is now. Hi, Mom. I'm just recording my video for my class. I just want to introduce you to my class. This is my mom. Okay. Her name is Pat. So.
Good morning. Disheveled.
Don't worry about it. So I'll be by tomorrow to pick you up for your appointment about 8:55.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you then.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye. All right, so continuing on now, we're going on now with long-term versus short-term orientation. Think about yourself here. This speaks to a culture and whether the people in that culture live for the moment, in essence, or whether they are trying to save something in the present for a better future. So if we can look at a savings account, for example, the whole idea of credit cards is very much speaking to a short-term orientation. Because when you spend money on a credit card, you're not spending money that you have. You're spending the bank's money. And then you're going to pay the bank back. And if you don't pay the bank back in full, you're going to pay the bank some interest. And so what you're doing is you're saying, you know what? I've got to have these clothes right now. I can't wait for them. I need them in the short term. So I'm going to take on some debt. Okay, but in a long-term culture, it's more about, no, we have the clothes that we need. We don't really have to express ourselves fashion-wise. We're warm. We're safe. Let's save our money. Let's put it away because you don't know whether we're going to need it in retirement or not. So that's more of a long-term oriented culture. Next up is the dimension of indulgence versus self-restraint. This also kind of speaks to the last dimension that we just spoke about. I'm not sure why Hofstede separated this out, but it's basically the idea of whether people and individuals in particular should satisfy their own needs with excesses versus holding off on those needs to exercise discipline and restraint. For example, when you go to France, you can see a child, 14 years old, going to a grocery store and buying 2 beers. Yeah, I've seen that. And I even saw the child when they got through the checkout line, the checkout counter took a paper towel and rolled the beer bottles up in it so they wouldn't get smashed because the child was on their bicycle, rolled them up delicately and put them in the child's bag, and the child went out and put them in their bike basket and rode on home. And the reason for that is because French people, even though you can start drinking at the age of 14 and younger with a glass of wine at the table, you don't see French people pounding beers. You don't see them doing shots. You don't see them drinking to excess. That would be considered indulgent. Now, compare that to the average Thursday night here in East Stroudsburg University at Marita's or any other drinking place. And you'll see students actually celebrating the concept of a blackout. Talking about how they got so wasted they don't remember anything that happened the next day, or at least some of the most important parts. And that's celebrated, right? It's laughed about. It's joked about. It's an example of self-indulgence. It's excesses for personal pleasure versus restraint, holding off and having some humility, I guess is a way to say it. All right, and that takes us to our final dimension, and that is environmental sustainability. So for environmental sustainability, it's a very popular catchphrase today, even on the campus of East Stroudsburg University, where we have a sustainability commission. The whole idea is developing the needs, or meeting the needs of today without sacrificing the needs of the future. So this tree right here, if we were going to take that tree down because we wanted to widen the sidewalk or make the parking lot bigger, a country that has a sustainability approach would say, we got to replace that tree. You can't take one away and not replace it. If you're going to take that tree away, you got to put another one up in its place. I went to Las Vegas for a conference, and I had a meal that had stone claw crabs. Have you ever had stone claw crabs? Well, first of all, it's an amazing crab to eat. It's got a lot of meat to it. But the most amazing thing from my point of view, because it's a sustainability item, is when you take a claw off of a stone claw crab, it grows another one. Yes, you're not really killing the crab. The crab is sustaining itself. And this is what that speaks to, this dimension. All right, not to be outdone, another researcher, actually 2 researchers, Trompenars, a man by the name of Trompenars who worked for the Shell Oil Corporation, teamed up with a researcher named Hampton Turner. There's a lot of names in there. And they came up with their own dimensions. I'm going to breeze through these a little bit because Gert's Hofstede's are the most prominent ones in intercultural communication. But Trompenars and Hampton's dimensions include universalism versus particularism. So universalism is where we tend to abide by general laws, and those laws hold place no matter what. So for example, the law of speeding. If you have a universal culture, you don't speed, period. You just restrain yourself. But in a particularism country, we have exceptions to that. So if you're in a particularism culture, you'll say, you know what, I live in Wyoming, and I know this 100-mile stretch of road that I'm about to drive, it's going to be very unlikely that there will be a police officer on that stretch. And listen, it's a straight road, and I need to get there as soon as I can. I'm going to be safe. I'm going to have both hands on the wheel. So I'm going to drive 90 miles per hour. I'm going to break the law because this particular circumstance warrants it. It's particularism versus universalism. All right, next up is individualism versus communitarianism, which speaks to the individualism versus collectivism dimension that we've already talked about. It has to do with, do you take care of yourself as the most important priority, or is it more important that you take care of the group, the family, the neighborhood, the culture? Next up is the dimension of specific versus diffuse. Now, this is an interesting dimension that was not gotten at by Gert Hofstede. And what this says is, in a specific culture, your workplace and your job are totally separate from your home life. When you go home, no more job. Don't talk about it, don't think about it, don't answer phone calls, etc. if you are in a specific culture. If you're living in a diffuse culture, then you are expected to be doing several things at once, all the time, including your work. And we can see that here in the United States, right? If you go on a vacation, which is hard to get in the United States, you get 2 weeks, the average person, when you've worked for a company for a long time. But you don't get to take those 2 weeks whenever you want. You have to work it out with your employer when it's convenient for them. And when you do take those 2 weeks, if you're in the Caribbean, sitting on a beach, it's very likely that you'll have your cell phone, and it's quite possible you're going to check your work email, and it's quite possible that you'll have a question that's asked you that you're going to answer, and so you've got a diffuse lifestyle. You brought your work home. All right, now that takes us to the next dimension, which is neutral versus emotional. In a neutral country, emotions are shielded. It's more important to remain objective, calm, and reasonable. In emotional cultures, it's the opposite. It's more important to express those emotions, to get those out. We can say in Mediterranean countries, those are very emotional. Britain, on the other hand, is very neutral. Germany, very neutral. The United States, it's called neutral in the book, but I do consider it to be very emotional as well. So I don't quite agree with that dimension. All right, next up is the dimension of achievement versus ascription. Achievement versus ascription. This is an interesting dimension as well. Also speaks to some of the previous dimensions. In an achievement culture, you are what you do. You're a garbage collector, that's who you are. I should say sanitation engineer. You're a professor, that's who you are. I tell you what, I'm kind of lucky to grow up in the United States because in this culture, the professor is a revered position. You know, I'm kind of placed above certain other positions because the status of a professor is a person who's educating and providing knowledge and researching. But in other cultures, again, I cite France a lot, the professor is more of a common person. The professor does not have the kind of esteemed status. They're a person who has some knowledge, but they're not necessarily seen as being at a different level from the students. That's not the case in our culture. So achievement versus ascription is when you're in an achievement culture, you are what you do. Whereas in an ascription culture, you are who you are. And you are who you are based on your family name. So for example, the Kennedys in the United States, we can say that's one tiny micro ascription element of our culture. The Kennedys are known as sort of the royalty of the United States. And you may not be as aware of it because you haven't lived during your lifetime probably as much as I have, with as many Kennedys in it, from John F. Kennedy to Ted Kennedy. But there was a new Kennedy coming on the scene, and he gave the response to the presidential State of the Union address. I don't know if you saw it or not, But it's an example of how that family name carries such weight that the Kennedy family is able to parlay that into fairly regular successful elections. We can say the same of the Bushes, by the way, and other families, the Clintons, for example, as well. That's an ascriptive dimension. You are who you are. And then finally, our last dimension is sequential versus synchronous time. In sequential versus synchronous time, it speaks to the idea that in a sequential society, you do one thing at a time, and you do it in order, and you do it on time. And we can say Germany is that way. Germany is very methodical. You must do this, and then you can do this. Versus a synchronous time culture, you can do multiple things at once, but time is more fluid. If it doesn't happen now, that's okay. If you're late, that's okay. If you do it tomorrow, that's okay too. We've talked about that in this class so far. All right, that brings us to the end of the chapter now, where Japan is focused on as a culture. And what an interesting country Japan is. So homogenous, first of all. I mean, it's like 98 to 99% Japanese. So the sameness amongst the peoples ethnicity-wise and the look of people is just incredible in Japan. Plus, it's an island where such a small percentage, don't remember exactly what it is, I think it's 12% of the country is inhabitable, because the rest is mountains or islands. It's over 3,000 islands in Japan. I bet you never knew that. I bet you thought it was probably just one island. And so in Japan, most of the people are living on the coast in that 12%. And it's got 125 million people. That's a lot of people living in that small island. So they're very reliant on imports from other countries, and they are very, very reliant on the ocean to provide raw materials, especially food. Religion-wise, Japan was visited by crusaders and Catholic missionaries, but it remains today largely Shinto, the religion of Japan, and Buddhist. But what makes Japan really interesting to me is something that wasn't even talked about in the chapter, and that is it largely was an Eastern country with collectivist values until the United States, I wouldn't say invaded it, but the United States certainly occupied it after World War II, General MacArthur. And General MacArthur set up the economy in Japan to be capitalistic. So Japan mirrors the United States in many ways in terms of its economy. And that places it in the middle of the continuum between an individualist society and a collectivist society. And that's what makes it very interesting. So you can read some more details about Japan on your own. But right now, that's going to bring to a close our chapter on dimensions of culture as I head into the Monroe building here at ESU. And I wish you all, not just you who's listening to this video, but I wish you all in this class a beautiful day.